So thank you very much for being here. I know that Europe is very difficult to get people out, especially when the sun is so precarious here, in and out, so you never really know when people are coming out or not. But I'm very happy, particularly with this lecture, also in coincidence with the exhibition that we have currently at the Kunstverein, which is like the idea of focusing on education and also pedagogical forms and what it means, particularly to like artistic productions within this time. The title of the talk is the Quagrey Effects and Precarious Gift. To begin with, the Quagrey is a name of someone. So it's an engineer in Ghana who worked for the railway for many years. You know, in Ghana, the railway was established in the late 1800s by the British, mostly as a medium for colonial extraction. So Ghana was called the Gold Coast because obviously there was a lot of gold in Ghana at the coast. But in the northern part of Ghana where I come from, at the time gold wasn't discovered. There was mostly iron ore. So even like in German occupied territory, which was like in Togoland and parts of the northern region, there wasn't really a lot of extraction of minerals in that sense. So the railway was never really built to the northern part of Ghana. And as an artist, I'm very much interested in these, like the disparities between these different geographical contexts and how that shaped like the lives of people there. Because my grandfather, for instance, was one of those people who migrated from the north to the south. They walked through the bushes to go to Accra, maybe like 2-3 months within the forest or things like that. And they used to tell stories of how people would die on these journeys and things like that. But it's also very much connected even to the whole colonial enterprise and how people were captured in Burkina Faso, other places, and then marched through these areas all the way to Accra, to the forts and castles, and then sent to the Americas. And again, when you're looking at it from the point of even like the First and Second World War, where a lot of soldiers were recruited from like the interlands. So people who had to migrate, especially during the First and Second World War, a lot of them were their first names were only used when they went to the war. So even a lot of them that died, there wasn't much information on them and all that. So people always had this thing of writing their name on their bodies, like creating some kind of biodata, either their name or the names of their ancestors or parents or things like that. And it was always a way of identifying their body or tracing their bodies back to a certain origin. And over time, they started like marking it on objects and other things. And the primary material I used in my work for, like when I was a student, was this jute sack, a very common material that is predominantly made in India and Bangladesh. And Ghana, we import it mostly for transportation of cocoa. You know, Ghana in the 20th century was the highest producer of cocoa in the world. And at the time, the money that was made from cocoa in post-independence was used in building this idea of a new Ghana. So like even the hydroelectric dam, which was built at the time towards industrialization, or the silos that were built together with like the architects from the Eastern Bloc, Russia, Poland, Yugoslavia, those things which were abandoned. You see a lot of those examples as we go on. So I'm really interested in this idea of the stain and what it means as a political medium within, let's say, objects. So you find that, so this is what I was talking about with relation to the body. And in some of the works that I make, which are like photography, I try to combine that, of course, with the original maps, cartographies that were produced in the early 20th century by the British. A lot of these have changed because some of these, the towns don't exist anymore now due to like climate shift or like even the building of the dam with the rivers expanding, the river base expanding and all that. So, and yeah, so I mostly, like my work also involves quite a lot of research with regards to thinking about these forms and what they mean, like how the body has shifted in terms of its meaning and taken different forms over the centuries or decades. As a student, I was very curious. I used to go to the markets all the time to collect objects from the market women. And what I would do is that I will go there, and then I would negotiate with the market women. I would buy new bags from the cocoa buying companies, and then I would give it to the market women because they needed these new bags anyway. The old bags they were using were old and very torn, like these ones. But I was really interested in this exchange, the exchange value within that, because one, they need new bags to sustain their business, and I need the old bags because they are torn and dead. Yeah, but it was very difficult for them to understand that in the first place, because if, you know, I think it's a general thing, but in Africa, people are very superstitious. They always think that when you take something of theirs, you're going to do some kind of black magic thing with it. But for me, it was very interesting to me to try to engage them in a conversation, particularly with regards to even thinking about the history of art, because most predominantly, a lot of these women were subjects of painting even in the 20th century. And I was, as a student, we were very much interested in ways in which we could rethink about the entire framework of even thinking about how an artist, if you're a painter, how you think about the medium of painting even in itself. So the collection led me into working like in sites. So for instance, going to churches and the construction, bridges that were made. So that was a bridge that was built by the Germans back in 1934. In 1992, they stopped using the bridge because they had to build another one. So the remnants of it is just there. So I like this idea that as a painter, you go to all these different types of spaces which are imbued with history, and then you engage with them through this artistic production. So the railway stations and others which are no longer in use or dysfunctional, I would go there and then I would work with the workers in order to be able to sew these materials or explore the forms that come from it. And this is one of the bridges also that was built by the British in the early 20th century in Kumasi, over the railway area. And that was one of the first projects that I did, which this railway engineer, Quagrey, he was the area manager of this station. And as a student, I went to see him and I said, I have this idea to wrap the bridge over these jute sacks. And it seemed very stupid. He was like, and what happens? And I said, well, I'm trying to expand the context of art. And he was like, it didn't, he wanted to see what was art about it. But though he didn't understand it, he was curious. So he said, sure, let's see what becomes of it. And then through that, that's when my interest in this idea of the railway connected to these objects, the jute sacks that I was collecting, and in thinking about the expansive form of art came into being. So in Greece, in Athens, during Documenta, the idea was also to engage with this material in Syntagma Square, where all the protests and everything happens. Instead of wrapping a building, the idea was to engage in this political process of sewing the bags together, particularly given the connections that they have to global transactions and movements and all that. So I spent a long time going back to this question of labor again, because from my point of view as an artist, I trained from the Kwame Nkrumah University, which was predominantly, the curriculum for a long time was the British curriculum, the hand and eye. And in the 2000s, there was a group of radical professors who shifted this. And so a lot of them were Marxists in a sense, and they were very much interested in how artists could really begin to think about this idea of transforming art from a state of commodity into a gift. And of course, in the global south, we live in a perpetual state of debt. And you're thinking as an artist, how do you really rethink about art, but not just as an object, but something which is like a phenomenon, as precarious as it can be. So the railway became the subject for, the railway together with other things became a subject for thinking. So I would just go there to look at work, the idea of work, without really doing anything, just photographing and looking at how these spaces were changing form. Because this space was built by the British in 1901. So I was also interested in how these spaces were transforming. A lot of the trains that were used there were German trains made in Kassel post-Second World War. So also thinking about it in relation to the history, like Ghana's independence and like the idea of like this economic independence program after 1957. So I just go around looking through the archive, collecting some of the archive and redistributing the archives, taking the archives from the south, which they were there for long, taking them to the north, or even going to England, to York, where the National Railway Archive is, to look into it and see ways in which we could extend the memory of those. So these are some of the archives of like trains used either in Zambia, South Africa, Ghana, elsewhere, which were mostly in the day used for colonial like extraction, cotton, bauxite, gold, whatever there is. This image is different. This is from post-independent Ghana, from factories, again, that were built. This was a paint factory for making household paints. And artists could even buy those paints and use them for their paintings or whatever. But some of these factories, again, during the structural adjustment, 70s, 80s, were privatized. And the companies, the objects, the metal and everything was sold, but the interior of the factory was left. So I, as an artist, a student, I just used to go around collecting the interior of these spaces, like the archives, the leftover wooden pieces and all that. So the train, as a political medium vessel, was, and has always been very important to me, because imagine these trains were used in like transporting all the gold, timber, cocoa, whatever, and now they've been left. They used to be vessels that were used to transport commodities like the jute sack, but now they have become commodities in themselves, in that the government is interested in selling them so they can melt them back into steel. And then but I was interested in the load of history embedded within these objects. So some of them had been cut into pieces. So I had to look for the people who had engaged in the cutting of these, the welders, and then pay them, because I had to rely on their memory to piece these trains back together again. Because when it becomes, it's not just a train anymore. Now it becomes like some kind of a sculpture that's like a living testimony of, let's say, the idea of time in itself. So, and you can imagine how heavy these objects are, like several tons. Like some of them are like up to like 80,000 kilos and others. So I would work with the workers at a railway, because a lot of these objects, more than a century old, are things that I believe that when they are put into a cultural context, they somehow can allow us to dig back into time and do new forms of archaeological excavations, both like from an geological perspective. So I would buy these objects from the scrap dealers and do that. But I was also interested in that connection to the, for instance, the work that I did in Documenta in Kassel, where we occupied one of the old Henschelhalle, where some of these trains that you're seeing were produced in, but then using them as production spaces. So this is the interior of some of the factories which were abandoned, which we, like with the black and white image, this is the same place. But how do you use the interior to produce, let's say, some of the artworks that I have made till date? Or even the interior of the old trains from Kassel, which, again, using them to produce new forms of objects, and those objects telling new stories. So in here, I would go back to the railway, and then the objects I would, the residues I would collect and produce works out of them. I would juxtapose them to the trains from Kassel. So I expanded this to all kinds of things, because now we are in an open field. Anything works. It could be a plane, it could be a train, it could be anything. So I would even look for like the old Yugoslavian, like there were some planes that were produced in back in the days, what's the name, Soviet Union period also. Objects that were left that were just waiting for a certain like faith to erase them, but thinking about ways in which we could transform them pedagogically, like transform them into classrooms, because I'm mostly interested in how art can somehow instill like a certain like idea into like another generation. So the idea of the transport was also like one of the highlight points. Like, how do you move an object from one place to the other, and what does it mean in the process of the moving itself? So a lot of these kids in these areas, it would have been the first time they would have seen an airplane, but the relationship between the plane and, for instance, the farm or the madhouse or the truck that transports tomatoes and all that. The idea was to demystify it, but at the same time open up new possibilities with regards to how these objects occupy space. And I use all kinds of techniques, of course, people that I work with, like electricians, people who do very ordinary work, welders and all that, but how do you transform that into creating this new position in terms of new types of institutions? So I like some years ago, I was very interested in this drone tech. So I have a drone that I always travel, like photographing things. So I would like document the moving of these objects across different spaces, 700 kilometers, whatever, even if it would take like 5-6 days, patiently just following it and documenting and looking at the relationship between these forms. This was from January this year, when we transported the trains after 10 years of like struggling to like acquire them from the States. And in Tamale, it was really interesting because there is we have one of the most interesting mosques in this area. And a couple of years ago, our government took this loan from China, and the Chinese, I think, yeah, what was it? They gave them a forest reserve in Ghana as a payment of the debt, in a way. And this forest reserve had bauxite in it or something like that, you know. And as part of that, the Chinese would build this bridge in my city in Tamale that went over the market, because when you're traveling from Kumasi to Burkina Faso, normally you have to go through this route when you get to the city. But it somehow created a space where cars and people could be on the same level as the mosque. But it looks like it's an interesting image because this is a train that was cut into pieces that we've reformed. But the whole idea of the image is a very disturbing one, because an entire forest was destroyed for this image to be possible. Of course, I didn't do it, my government did. But I'm also really interested in the criticality of like what constitutes the objects that, the images that are created within that. And at the center of it is, let's say, a train from Kassel or something coming from the period after the Second World War. So in this, these, you see the jute sack. So I also like some of these images where you're photographing the event, and then the train, the truck carrying the onions from Burkina Faso going to the south versus the train that has been restored going back to going to the north. Yeah, so there's almost like some kind of an exchange there. And yeah, so here I was slightly a Rasta man. We had this was in the beginning, in January this year, when we were making a transport. And because a lot of the work that I do also focuses on the experience of children within these spaces, I was filming with a drone, and there was one village where the kids were very curious about it because obviously they hadn't seen this technology before. But interestingly enough, they hadn't, of course, like anyone who is, even in my father's generation, those who never traveled, or even my grandfathers, no one ever saw a train before, or a train track, or what it was. Because each time I went to schools and I was talking about ideas and like technology and all that, they were somehow lost. Of course, maybe the closest they could have seen it was in a movie or on TV or something. So they saw the train for the first time. It was really interesting with regards to the conversations that we had within that period. So I really like this idea of the first encounter with these objects and what it meant, even as precarious as it was. In this instance, this young girl was coming from the stream. Like where I come from in the northern part of Ghana, it's even impossible to get the government to connect a pipeline to this area. But then, what does it mean that if you're an artist coming from a space like that, if you are interested, for instance, in asking other questions regarding, let's say, expanding cultural forms or values, what does it mean within that context? Because there's a lot actually to explore. So I would work with the workers from the railway to rebuild these lines. So this is the first time that a train line was built in this geographical context in the world. So what does it mean now for this line to be built within this space as a cultural phenomenon, as a cultural institution, like a space where people can engage in? But I'm also interested in how young people, like can witness this idea of excavating, this idea of laying these lines. It's like you're doing an archaeological exercise, but you're not excavating anything. You're rather burying something, which is in a way excavating, let's say, memories that are yet to become, or ideas, future ideas or things like that, or imaginations or things like that. But these are imaginations that somehow are coming from the future, but at the same time dwell in the past. So I'm really interested in these forms and what they mean. I guess here, no one ever goes to the train line to do anything because you'll be hit by a train. But what does it mean now that we take these train lines from 1890, which represents the height of colonialism, like global extraction, and then now presenting it again as a precarious gift to another generation, to reimagine the idea of occupying space, no matter how ridiculous it is, or the form of it, with regards to thinking about the subjects of painting. So there are different forms, and this is one of the images from the greenhouse at a red clay, where we were putting this train and combining this idea of the train, the old train, together with like plants and new ecosystems. And then, like, of course, doing workshops where kids come to experience, let's say, the activities, the burial of these objects. So in a way, you are creating these new witnesses also, because in 20, 30 years, when these kids are adults like us, I believe that there is a shift in the way that they are going to look at the world, or the way they are going to look at the subjects of art in itself. So when these objects now are there, it's a subject for play, because for me, I always joke that when I was a child, I didn't play enough. So now that I'm an adult and I'm an artist, I am playing with everything that I can find, seriously, but also thinking about ways in which it allows for, let's say, children to really rethink about how they engage with these objects from a playful point of view. So these are just some of the images of the interior of the airplanes where we do workshops. We have TV screens, projectors, we teach robotics, coding, whatever. The idea of the singularity, where you bring like all kinds of opposing ideas, effects, forms together, which allows for, let's say, possible imaginative forms, is very important. So drawing classes, because sometimes people would say, but the artist says he is interested in expanding the notion of art or painting, but he's not making any paintings, he's just moving aircraft from one place to the other. I'm like, yeah, but what happens within these objects and all that? Because people always think that I'm anti-painting. And I'm like, no, I'm rather interested in the reglorification of painting, because if you cannot think about an expanded view of looking at art, then there is no point in looking at it even in the first place. So the idea of transformation, which was central to these questions, you'd find them in buildings that already exist, like some of the buildings that were made, let's say, back the 1950s, that were abandoned, that now, as artists, we can use the works that we produce. For instance, the jute sack that I would use to make a work, it would be sold to a museum, and then I would use the money to buy back this building that was abandoned in 1950, and then I would make it, let's say, into a public space. Already it's a public building, but not accessible. States, but not really public. But now, how do we use the contradictions of art in itself to create new cultural phenomena or spaces? So we work with all kinds of people in the city to make these, to bring these forms back to life. And this building is called the Nkrumah Volini, which was, when it was abandoned at the time, there was a propaganda that Ghana was building these nuclear bunkers during the Cold War, which wasn't true, of course. The city tried to seal it. They poured a lot of sand into the building, and there was water in it for many decades. So we had to draw out the water and dig out the sand, almost like Indiana Jones treasure hunting type of a thing. And you'd think that it's some kind of illegal mining or mining activity or something like that. But once we did, we realized that there was a whole ecosystem. There were bats living in the building. There were snakes living in the building. There were birds. But the idea was to find ways in which we could allow for the ecosystems to be part of the conversation of the building with regards to how young people could experience culture when it comes to thinking about cohabitations of life. And this was in the height of COVID also, so it was a bit tricky, you know. So people were saying, but the bats are giving us coronavirus. And yeah, and I'm like, but humanity has been the biggest single disaster in this planet. So we've almost brought the planet to a brink of destruction since the industrial age. So there is a lot more, even in the height of COVID. I was very careful to think about making those choices about getting rid of the ecosystem, because for me, I thought that the idea of the volley, which was in our language symbolized the void, but also at the same time created all these possibilities for rethinking about what this space could be. So one of the interesting things is also to think about what art does in terms of transformation, because our caretaker at Red Clay, Zachariah, who would contribute his labor, for instance, to the building of these spaces, at the same time, he would also be the one to give tours to the school children sometimes when they come on, let's say, the work of Western artists, in this case, Olafur Eliasson. And ordinarily, I don't think many artists, particularly from the West or other places, centers of capital, will easily go to the global south or elsewhere to do exhibitions and things like that. So we collaborated with this museum in Aarhus, and when they gave us the piece on loan, I was really interested in how young people could deal with it, or how even the idea of a local farmer who is like constantly engaged in a conversation of culture and building new types of institutions and space could engage them in the local language with regards to that. And also, like people that live in the city ordinarily, like the tuk-tuk drivers, like this guy who came with 2 tourists, but was so interested in what the program had to offer that he closed work immediately and went home to bring like all the kids in his house because he wanted them to experience this cultural phenomenon. Yeah, and I like that how he puts the wood in between at the end to prevent them from falling out, because it's so precarious, because these tuk-tuks are supposed to carry 3 people. We can imagine all these kids in this thing, you know. So, but that's the thing, art is so precarious. Here, maybe it's easy. In Europe, people wake up, they go to the U-Bahn, they take the train, they get a coffee. But in many parts of the world, the idea of living even to begin with, before you even start thinking about, let's say, engaging cultural phenomena and things like that, is something else. So constantly we're trying to find out what that means as we're doing it. And you realize that even some of the kids who have grown up around these institutions, now we're thinking, what does it mean that now maybe they grow up in a different, thinking differently, where they can they can engage in the archives and other things that we're building through these institutions communally by engaging with other kids in that. And also in a patriarchal society where women are mostly at home, either waiting for their husbands to come back home, cooking, taking care of the children, now engaging in cultural institutions, phenomena, things like that. What does it mean, particularly within that sense where we have to re-engage with history? And you remember the image from the markets in the beginning where the women were standing with the thing around the charcoal. And these are the same type of women. And now they would come with buses with their kids in a tuk-tuk or whatever. The idea, because there is a new sense of engagement with culture and what it means. And I'm always very fascinated when I go back home and you see the women on their motorbikes. They're so fashionable, you know. But immediately when you start thinking about culture, they're like, no, but these women, because historically, of course, people would only dress up very well to go to weddings, funerals, or baby showers or whatever it is. But the idea that now we create this new language or cultural phenomenon is very, very important, I believe. So even you see sometimes the women will come put their kids on the engine. And it's not for me, I'm really interested in how everything works together within these spaces as it is happening. So the Parliament of Ghosts also borrows from that form where the trains, again, these are the trains from Kassel, post-Second World War. So again, using them from the inner parts of the trains, using them to build parliamentary forms for conversations. And I don't think when I made the Parliament of Ghosts, it wasn't necessarily for people to sit together and engage, but it was the idea that the objects were having a dialogue among themselves because of the history that they were coming from. But this was in Manchester at the Whitworth. It was part of the Manchester International Festival in 2019. And then COVID started, and then when I went back to Ghana, I had so much time. Obviously, I was not traveling. It was such a gift. And I said, okay, why not build a parliament as an architectural form? So instead of staging the work this time in Tamale, because of the collection that we're building, the idea was to build it as a stage. So you can see the differences between like building a work and then versus, let's say, staging a work within, let's say, a cultural institution or a museum. So I was following the processes of the building, like even as kids in the community would come and swim in the building, in the water that was gathering in the building when it rained, and what it meant, or how they would just come there to like spend time looking at the construction workers working. And mind you, art from 20th century, modern art museums, like, of course, no one is ever allowed in the construction site, but a construction site has so much to offer, particularly when you're looking at it beyond just safety measures and things like that. So we even would write to the metro, invite the students, and give them tours on the building. Because, again, as I said, 30 years from now, these kids are going to be the ones who inherit these institutions, and their children after. The way they relate to them and will be very different. So I'm really interested in ways in which we do these kinds of occupation. So sometimes you realize that even as we're building, we're using it for classroom activities, where the builders are building it at the same time, and you also have other kids who are looking at it from a very different perspective or something. So sometimes I'll also make collages of like, even before we got access to the trains, of like how these things could be occupied. You'd also see like some of the buildings that we're constructing for years. We would use them to make very large-scale drawings. And these, some of them, of course, this is not as large, but I would make drawings, for instance, that would redetermine the way we think about space in the future, even within the construction site itself. Sometimes I would invite people to give lectures, or myself, I'll give lectures to students from primary school to universities, or for concerts, or all types of things, even in the building process. Or thinking about the idea of the post-commodity space. So using the parliament as a space for all these constructions of ideas and forms, which even within, let's say, Western institutions, it might not be possible because of the form that the work takes. So I'll just go through some of these. And it takes on all these different forms. You can imagine with this one, after scooping the ground, we had to pour all the sand back into the space for, and within the history of African art, especially also coming from the 20th century, because a lot of our predecessors were somehow occupied with this subject of representation, where there was always an idea to represent something rather than dealing with the forms, certain types of forms that would shift the way art was produced or being made. But then again, one of the questions is, we are talking about art, so there are different questions, the form, the processes and all that. So the women that Zachariah from the community might be coming for tours, that he might be talking to them, like trying to explain what the institution is, or the collection is, the archive and everything. They might be the same women that we're working with in order to be able to transform a part of the institution into a cornfield. So there are unresolved questions in my mind, but for me, I'm really interested in what does it really mean, or what does it really represent. Or going to schools in places where it's almost impossible to get to, there's no drinking water or electricity or whatever, but taking, let's say, a generator to go and give a lecture. The other day I was in Slovenia, because I'm the artistic director for the Ljubljana Graphic Art Biennial, and I was invited to give a lecture in the square. And I wanted us to use a TV screen for showing images like this. But there wasn't, that area, they didn't have electricity. And I said, oh, do you have a UPS something, blah, blah, blah. They said, no. I said, do you have I was asking the people in the office. But because in Europe, you never have like these power outages and all that. So the way you relate to life is very different. Whereas in Africa, even our mobile phones is more than enough to power a house or something, because we are always expecting everything not to work. So it's very different, the way you relate or how you create. So the subjects of architecture, even locally, things that are not very much engaged all the time, we try to engage them within the context of the parliament. And they seem very ridiculous. They are not things that, they are not, the idea was never to like produce them as works for exhibitions or anything. But the idea of just experimenting with objects and forms, even the same objects and how they change, like building market scenes, bringing goats, animals into the space. The old man in the front is Mr. Doglo, and he's a bricklayer. There are very few bricklayers in Ghana, but I've worked with him for years to build this institution. And for me, the question is, how do you build a theater as an actor, as a worker within this theater? So the theater is not being built for a stage, but the process of building the theater itself is where the stage is. So this is the Mr. Doglo with his workers. So you're thinking, how do you combine these subjects at the same time? So this is the National Theatre in Ghana, which I wrapped in 2016, a year after the institution we started building it. So there's a question also of like thinking about this idea of the theatricality of like using these objects. The jute sack is the same thing that is producing, let's say, the what's the name, the residue that is inspiring these forms. So there are so many different examples. Of course, I would make drawings in relation to some of the works in New York in the High Line, which are also borrowed from some of these subjects and form, looking at the paradoxes of, let's say, space and all that. Again, in this, you'd see that in the building of the greenhouse, when we started last year, it was also, again, looking at like how like the kids from schools would engage with these things, even in the process of like the shifting of it, again, like collecting archaeological materials, pots, and all kinds of things which would be normally destroyed, and then bringing them within the institution and combining them, let's say, with the contemporary forms of building, turning them into systems of irrigation and all that. What does it really mean, particularly within this growing generation, that these forms that we're experimenting with? So this is in the greenhouse that we're using part of it as a runway for fashion shows and all that. So what does it mean to be able to like create a space that allows for ecological forms, ecosystems to grow and all that in relation to machines? Some of them, they were ideas that came from the trains that had plants, food and other things growing in them already as they were failing. So history already presents these forms. But in the 20th century, we couldn't look at these things because I believe that there were we were too much distracted. And I feel like in our generation, this is the time for us to look at these things. We need to take our time, clear our head in order to be able to relook at these forms. So in the greenhouse, we have all these types of plants, spices, and other things that we are concentrating on as a cultural form in building. So these are some of the images that you see. So the last part of the presentation talks about the idea of preservation. Like even as a young artist myself, I've always thought, what happens to my work or my legacy in the next 30, 40, 50 years? Or what happens to my legacy in the next 100 years? Because a lot of the artists in Ghana, even an artist like El, for many years, no one knew his work in Ghana. It was almost impossible to ask young people about most of these artists. So the subjects of using the residue from the work that goes around the world in order to be able to rebuild this for a new sense of engagement is important. So you would find that all these works that I produce, which are in collections around the world, I build spaces permanently for them to be stored around Ghana so that young people can engage with these differently. That's my assistant, Benjamin. So these are different, like in Berlin, when I did the DAD versus the work in Ghana. I did this work at the White Cube Capital Corpses, but in Ghana, you see the difference because in the White Cube, artificial life, of course, all the things that we, from modernism, versus, for instance, in Ghana, we barely have access to electricity, so you can use the same conditions. So even the architecture in relation to how the work is engaged with is very different. So I'm also very much interested in, again, how we produce these cultural phenomenons. Gabrielle and I were looking at the vinyl collection that you have for your interventions, and I've been collecting a lot of these also, High Life others. There was a project I did in Nantes at the FRAC last year. So you would see some of these. So these are buses that we would send to the communities to bring the kids for the exhibitions and all that, because it's not enough just to build an institution, especially in this context, but also how we engage or how we go out of our way, because a lot of the kids who are coming, in order to entice them to come, you have to provide food, you have to go and meet their parents, you have to meet the metro. So there are a lot of systems involved in it, because again, as I said, for many, many years, many decades, there was this debt that was there. And it didn't really allow for, it will take more years for us to be able to get there. But these are some of my colleagues from the university. We have the Black Star Lines Collective, where the idea of young people coming together to work together and then, for instance, do interventions like working with artists, doing retrospectives on their works, like Dawson and Ajimano say. So that's Kwesi, one of my colleagues that I'm working with on Ostenbrook, who I think will be coming here at some point. And my colleague Salom, who is the artistic director of the institution, and how we use the exhibitions as workshops, converting the institution into classrooms, allowing for different generations to engage, the different exhibitions and forms that we've done. So mind you, these are different institutions I'm talking about. SCCA is different, Red Clay is different, and Chroma Volley is different. We have these forest areas and cemeteries, all the different phenomenons, what it means, even engaging artists' works, commissioning younger artists to produce works that normally in a different generation, maybe that would have not been possible. Yeah, and the teachers from these areas are the ones, they are the heroes actually, because I don't know how many people, when they are sent into a place where there is rarely drinking water or you can get malaria, you would like to go there. But I'm also inspired by the idea that a lot of these teachers, even when they are paid, as precarious as their salaries are, they sometimes contribute to their salaries to buy uniforms for the kids to wear, So that's why you see that some of the uniforms are much bigger than the kids, because they like to give them the uniform so that as they're growing, the uniform fits into their body, So it's also really interesting when you're thinking about these forms, these gestures, and actually what they mean for the future. So I also like the idea that now these cultural phenomena are beginning to shift the way young people and also older people, so engineers, doctors, people who normally would have said that, but art or archaeology, all those things are not important, but now they feel it's important. They would like to bring their children to see exhibition, medical students. Before, when I was a student in the university, when I'm allowed to say when we're young, there was always this tension between the different departments. Even art and architecture were not allowed to meet together again. But now that we are creating these cultural phenomena, it allows for all these different practitioners to realize that at the end of the day, we're really interested in expanding cultural views and all that. And also how it affects different generations, even the same family, how this new phenomenon of creating institutions that opens up the community can inspire them. The labor from young people within the community who are interested in contributing their labor to building things. So this is the image of red clay, an aspect of the land, which you find all the different things that we have there, archaeology, museum, residency. This is where I live, mind you, because I started building this as a home to live in, but started thinking about ways in which it could expand. So from a studio to a public institution, I still live there anyway, and my parents are always worried about it because even in the evening there are people there, and they're like, "How about your security and all that?" But come on, I really don't think about that. But I also like the idea of the rail line as a scar within the landscape. So you see how it takes a different shape, and this is the last image. So you can look at it again in relation to this architecturally, because the jute bag, which I started with, which had the stain, the market women, when they would take it and cut it to take out the commodity, and then the bag would later on dye, and then we'll stitch it up to create this installation. That would be used to make the artwork that would go into a collection of, let's say, MoMA or Tate or whatever. And then that capital would be used in, for instance, building all these institutions or projects, or buying back spaces from the 20th century and before, and then making them into new cultural phenomena that present a new sense of gift to another generation. So maybe a century from now, kids will be looking back and saying, oh, 100 and something years ago, there was a group of artists who actually sacrificed their entire practice in order to be able to create this new cultural phenomenon. Because then now, artists who are practicing, they can look at art differently, even the way they think about the subjects of materiality and all that. So again, this is very precarious. So I'll leave the lecture here with the precarious gift. So this is where the precarious gift is in. Yeah. Thank you.